In the last chapter, we went into some depth concerning articulation, and more specifically, articulation when using string instruments. Now we can do much the same thing, but with the woodwinds. In order to show this, we have chosen another piece of music. It is a piece from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and hopefully you will see that we once again can create a realistic rendition of the piece rather quickly. Once again, we are using the VSL library. We have loaded some flutes, a couple of oboes, a couple of clarinets, and some bassoons. These presets have been slightly edited. I've specified 4 articulation options: staccato, sustain, sforzato, and legato. Staccato can be controlled as we see here with the modulation wheel. It is assigned to expression via CC1. However, as I also want to control staccato with key velocity, we can see on this advanced settings page that we specify velocity crossfade to be off. If we look at the sustain instrument, we will see that it is set to global on, and is therefore controlled via the modulation wheel, not key velocity. The key switches are assigned in much the same way as they were for the strings. I'll start by playing in the flute. Of course, you can choose any instrument to start with, but for example starting with the piccolo flute might not be ideal compared to the standard flute, simply because it will not be strong enough. Here we can see the switching between the different articulation options as I play. Sforzato gives me a fast attack and a relatively quick decay, and when I switch to sustain, we get the held notes once again. So I will do my usual technique of recording the modulation wheel right at the beginning of the piece, so that my MIDI controller is at the desired level, and then I can use the key switches to play the music in. So now we have one take performed with the key switches. We won't quantize as we want to keep the feel of the music. Although I played to a click, I still allowed myself the freedom to play around that click track in order to keep the feel of the music without it sounding too rigid. We won't be going in and editing this piece simply due to time limits, but also because it's important to see how you can create an arrangement without spending hours and hours of editing. This is simply a real-time recording that hopefully shows you how you can create a good arrangement relatively quickly. And now we can record the second flute voice. Here I will try and avoid doubling voices for reasons we have explained previously. The second flute only plays here at the beginning, so it's rather short. And now I'll overdub my modulation wheel simultaneously on both tracks, simply to add a touch more dynamics. I could have chosen to add the modulation wheel at the end of the recording, but once again, as I want to play in the following instruments, it is better for me to have a more dynamic guide to play to. The next instrument we are going to record is the oboe. Here, I also set my modulation wheel to a relatively high setting in order to hear the instrument correctly. And I'll simply perform the musical notes with the key switching. Having done the first voice, I can move straight on to the second oboe. And here, in the middle, the second oboe doesn't actually play. So now, having recorded the second voice, I'll go through and add the modulation wheel in order to adjust the dynamics. If we look at it now, we can see towards the end I lowered the dynamics somewhat, and you can see that the overall dynamics are adjusted quite clearly. One thing I could do would be to combine the modulation track with the actual key data, but it's not really necessary right now. For the clarinet, I am simply using the sustain sample to show that you can play the part in without resorting to key switches. Having said that, if I layer a staccato sample with the sustain sample, in my opinion, it sounds even better. The staccato sample is controlled via key velocity, and the sustain sample is controlled simply with the modulation wheel. So this gives me the option of adjusting the level of the sustained note while controlling the attack with the key velocity. In the middle, we have a legato passage, and using the controller CC1 and the modulation wheel, I can adjust how loud the legato passage is. And now we can add the second clarinet voice. Now we can play the bassoon, and I am simply using the sustain sample here. One thing to remember is to leave gaps, much like a bassoonist or a woodwind player would, in order to breathe. Next, we come to the second voice. And next we come to the contrabassoon, which is the lowest of the woodwind. And yet again, I am simply using the sustain sample. So now we have recorded all the individual parts, and I'll turn the tempo back up to 140 BPM and turn the click off. But one thing we have left out by mistake is the piccolo flute. So I'll add that now, and I'll play it in at full tempo. If we now look at the flute track, we can see that I switch between 3 articulation options. So hopefully you have seen how we can create, in a relatively short space of time, a rather good performance. In the next chapter, we will be using a more comprehensive library to perform the same piece.